I started to do some experimental work. I started, I've got a foot in the psychological domain. I pulled out psychological scales and sat down and I talked to people about their experience of God and their experience of prayer and how long they prayed and what kind of spiritual experience they had. And I gave them a couple of scales. And it turned out that there was a scale called the absorption scale that's got a bunch, who knows what this thing really picks up. It's got 34 items. You say true or false, does the item apply to you? And it's things like, sometimes I like to watch the way clouds change in the sky, or sometimes I experience things the way that I did when I was a child. They seem to be items that capture whether you are comfortable being caught up in your imagination. And that scale predicted or correlated with a bunch of the things that I was interested in church. The more highly you scored on the absorption scale, the more likely you were to say that you had a back and forth relationship with God. The more likely you were to say that you experienced God with your senses. And the more likely you were to say that you had these vivid experiences of God and that sometimes God talked back audibly, which happened. And so, and I should say these auditory experiences, they're not psychotic experiences. And in fact, these days I spend a lot of my time fretting about the differences between spirituality and psychosis and how they are similar, but how they are also different. The folks that, when people are psychotic, people who meet criteria for schizophrenia, they often have auditory experiences. They hear many, many voices throughout the day. The voices, they hear paragraphs and whole conversations. They hear many, many voices. And what those voices say is, at least in this culture, is usually pretty awful. When people report these auditory experiences of God, they report a handful of experiences. They say things like, God spoke up out of the back seat of the car and said, I will always be with you. Or he sat in the front seat. Lots of these. It's not uncommon for these to happen in cars. I will always love you, or get off the bus. God will say these short little sentences. People experience them as being generated outside of their head, and they're startling. People often stop the car and sort of shake, and then they cry. But they're good experiences. So I also, and the higher you score in absorption, the more you're likely to say those experiences and the more that you're likely to report.